Hello and welcome back. This is Alex Schneiderman here, and this is the fourth and final chapter, you'll be relieved to know, of my uh, take and discussion about Fred Ritchin's book, The Synthetic Eye. You may be very familiar with me holding this book now, but it is and still and remains the only accessible reader about photography, particularly documentary photography, or whatever falls into that category, in the age of AI. Now, today we covering two chapters, 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is titled "Synthetic Challenges," and it's where Fred Ritchin goes into the challenges facing the reader of photographs and the institutions and organizations that distribute them in the age of AI. And then chapter 7, which is titled Shifting Paradigms. And it's really a rather a conclusion chapter where Ritchin discusses where do we go from here and suggests some fixes and criticism of how we are building a fortress around the value of truth as we move into the AI era. Okay, so I'm going to start with synthetic challenges, and I'll just go through my notes that I sort of made, as I have always done. I made sort of pretty exhaustive notes going for every chapter, and I'll just be led by them. So on page 181, Ritchin asks, what point should AI be regulated, and is it too late? I'm paraphrasing. Adobe stock is already releasing huge numbers of AI images into the marketplace, which are not marked as AI. And there are many thousands of fictitious depictions of the real world, as it were. I mean, for example, there are AI images of people at Black Lives Matter protests that never happened, for example, and those are, and I did, well, we'll come up, I mean, Adobe is, in the book, remember, which was published in, well, now getting on for 2 years ago, in the book, Ritchin notes that Adobe is spearheading the content authenticity initiative, which, as he quotes, focuses on systems to provide context and history for digital media. And I took a quick look at that today, just before I started recording. And when you go on the Content Authenticity Initiative, it looks a lot more like a sort of copyright protection scheme for photographers and content creators in general, which Adobe are offering. Now, I think it's a beta mode, so it isn't even in the main sort of mix of Adobe's Creative Cloud offer or whatever, and whether it's available free to non-Adobe users as well as to the Creative Cloud membership. I don't know, but it doesn't look like it at the first glance that it's really an activist move, part of Adobe, as it were, to control the spread of AI fakes, or to legitimize real photography in an AI era. Okay, so Google will allow AI-generated images in response to user requests for historical images. So, and that has grave implications for real photography made over the last 200 years, because it means that what that means is that, let's say you wanted to research the civil rights marches of the 60s in America well, Google will return images of that of those occasions with AI images included. I.e., depicting people and places that never actually happened, and that is obviously problematic if you want to, because they're just representative. They're sort of an artist. They're no better than an artist's illustration in a court, and those sort of awkward watercolors that you see coming out of courtrooms every day. I mean, and probably at least the artist illustrations from courtrooms have some kind of commitment to the truth, whereas there's no guarantee that there's any commitment to the truth. And going back, you may remember to an earlier point that Ritchin made about how representative of reality are AI historical constructions, i.e., we don't. I mean, a march in the '60s, which was attended by a huge majority by black people, in his example in an earlier chapter, showed many white faces and was completely and utterly wrong. So the algorithm completely built it wrong. So this is why this is a real warning, because AI is there is no there seems to be no structure or even appetite by the big content companies or search engines to control the dissemination of AI images where they should not be returned in response to prompts or questions by historians or interested citizens. Deep fake videos circulate freely online, Ritchin notes, and when so many people get their news from alternative sources on social media, which has no editorial oversight, how can anyone be expected to tell the difference between real and the fake? And this is the beginning of Ritchin's point about education, and how can we exist? How can the reader, the citizen of say, let's say, Western liberal democracies and more repressive and autocratic regimes inform themselves if they don't understand the terrain in which images are being and videos are being made? And he goes on to say, most people do not, this is a straight quote, most people do not have sufficient media literacy to understand how easily photographs or videos can be manipulated or simulated. And as a result, they lack the skepticism necessary to help undermine these attacks, his word, attacks. And he goes on to note that women in particular, and increasingly men, are vulnerable to AI fakery, even when they know it is fake. Images that are labeled as AI do not stop women from comparing themselves with fake forms. So there's an interesting psychological wrinkle there, which is that even when we know something is fake, we can't help but compare ourselves with that fake thing, and that has obviously deep psychological consequence for humanity. I mean, it is how the human mind works, and AI is in there and it is changing things. At the time, so on page 186, Fred Ritchin notes that at the time of writing, I note that Fred Ritchin notes that the AI algorithms accentuate tropes rather than diminish them. And in this way, a search for Muslim people will return men with head coverings, prisoners are black, leaders are men, and attractive people are white. Now, I caveat this by saying that this is 2 years ago. No doubt the algorithms are becoming more reflective and representative of the people who are prompting them. So, but the point is that that is a real danger. That who owns the the uh, the method of broadcast owns the story, and it isn't the people, it isn't the content creators who own it or the concerned citizens who own it. It is the decisions made by the people at the top, or their omissions, I should say, in not caring particularly about what their software returns, whether it's a search, a straightforward search, or a generative model that creates images. Okay. Um, to combat, I mean, he says that we don't know what is going on in the data sets. We don't have access to the data sets, and we have no control over how the algorithms are, what they're training on, and what algorithmic calculations they're using to create images, and that should be addressed in some form of civil legal framework that AI organizations and content distributors should be regulated by. I'm reading between the lines because I'm assuming that he would imagine that some form of formal regulation would be necessary here. Um, so to combat AI biases, Ritchin advocates for the routine teaching of media literacy alongside maths and English. It's becoming increasingly important to be able to be literate in a visual sense, and we need to treat and the I mean, forget people my age, but children coming up need to know when they're being taken for a ride. They need to know when something is true and when something is an image is being, or a video is being used to coerce them into, or coerce them into one way of voting, let's say, or purchasing or making some sort of decision without the full facts to hand, and instead being fed a lie, basically a very convincing lie. And whereas that we used to do that with words, we now do that with images, and that is why we need to teach visual literacy at a very fundamental stage. Okay, so then Ritchin now begins to address the position of the photographer in the light of the AI. He quotes John Berger when he says that photographs do not translate, when Berger said this, photographs do not translate from appearances, they quote from them. And I noted that this is the bedrock of Ritchin's idea that photographers become interpreters rather than recorders. Now, as he goes on to build up, he now sees the role of the photographer. I think this is a key bit of the book, in fact, that Ritchin sees the role of the photographer as no longer being a recorder in the field, somebody who goes around with the camera, whether you're doing news photography or or more sort of humane social documentary or whatever. But if you're using your camera to tell the truth, as it were, he is now saying that you should now see your role not as a straightforward recorder, but as an interpreter. And so you become part of the story of the truth of your images. So you become an agent in the dissemination and absorption of the content that you create to the outside world. And so to this end, Ritchin on page 190 lays out his proposal for a new epistemology of photography known as non-fiction photography. This is Ritchin's term, non-fiction. And so I say that Ritchin links photography to its etymological roots of writing with light, i.e., that it is a plastic art first and foremost and should not rely on the actuality of the image-making process to derive its integrity as a truth-telling medium, rather that it is the intention of the photographer that the veracity of an image in which, let's say, that the intention in which, of the photographer in which the veracity of an image can be found. The photographer is now writer in light and has the same obligations to the truth as an actual writer has. Now, let me unpack that, because it's a big, that was my sentence, as it were, my comment on Ritchin's idea of non-fiction photography. What that means is that he now, so to put it maybe in another way, Ritchin now sees photographers as having the same responsibility to the truth as writers do. That is to say that they have to be able to, that they become, so if you think about writers, in fact, that there are some writers who, because of their reputation for diligence and integrity, let's say, have greater weight in the press, let's say. I mean, typically because, and their reputations are founded on their ability to tell true stories and but not only that, so they're not just truth tellers. They go out into the field and they decide what is the important part of the story. This is the writer. So when you read read an article in the newspaper about, say, Iran or Ukraine or Sudan or wherever, or whatever the story, the writer's job is not just to record everything that's there verbatim, like literally transcribing from the real world onto the page. Their job is to decide what is the most important and salient parts of reality that they're going to jot down, form into an article, and then print. And I say print in the most general sense of the word. So Ritchin thinks that photographers need to become like writers in that respect. That that non-fiction photography allows a certain amount of creative input from the photographer, allows the photographer to highlight certain areas, to diminish certain other areas that they think are less important, but that their work fundamentally adheres to the truth of the matter. And it's a tricky one because, if you diminish one side of the story, somebody will always criticize you. But I suppose in a world where it's very hard to say that there's an empirical truth that we can seize on in the way of conveying stories, human stories, then this may be the best way forward if we're trying to create a confidence in the reader in an age of AI. Okay, so in practical terms, the photographer would, when they photograph let's say, an event or something like that, that they would photograph it freely and creatively. They'd be allowed to submit their own edit of the photos, pretty much as they do now, and it would be completely acceptable for them to indulge in more creative ways of telling the story, but they would have to be clear at the same time that their photographs did not deviate from the fundamental truth of the story. And in this way, they become light writers and therefore writers in light. So they become literally writers and much more closely allied with their verbal counterparts. Ritchin notes here an attempt at a definition of non-fiction photography: a recording of the visible in which the photographer strives to represent actualities, events, people, etc., in a fair and accurate manner with appropriate context. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. Um, uh, but a non-fiction photographer would have the latitude to clean up an image, just as the writer has the latitude to edit spoken words for clarity. Alterations would be forbidden. So, in this instance, it would be okay for a photographer to, in Richard's world, it would be okay for a photographer to crop an image, let's say, but they couldn't make a wholesale change to the content of the image. So they could not change the color of a table, for example, or the people present in the room. They can crop because that may help zone in on the most important part of the story in the image, leaving less to distraction. But they could not fundamentally change the image in any way. So Ritchin seems to aver that the photographer themselves becomes part of the truth value of the work, as their integrity should be queried by the viewer. And I wrote my own observation here. I quite like the idea of the non-fiction photographer, but I am uneasy about the contradiction between self-assessment integrity and the reader's ability to estimate this correctly. However, if it becomes a thing, I would not stand in its way. The standard of non-fiction photography relies heavily on the viewer having the ability or the will to discern between fact and fiction. And I think what Ritchin is doing here is he's positing an idea, a sort of a utopian idea, perhaps, maybe an idealistic idea, which is the only kind of ideas that matter. Of course, we can be practical, but we really need to have we need people to suggest the ultimate form before we break it down, and my worry about the non-fiction photography in Ritchin's terms is that the reader is not capable or interested in those facets and tenets of non-fiction photography that Ritchin advocates for. And therefore, non-fiction photography would be a great thing, but it would be a bit of a so what in the marketplace, because people just aren't that interested in it, and nor are they literate enough or concerned enough to grapple with the notions behind it, and the ethics that brought it into being. So Ritchin notes here that this goes on to the ownership of images and who owns the image now. And he notes on page 191 that Napoleon Sarony was the first photographer to be attributed with legal copyright in 1882 for a portrait of Oscar Wilde, in which he was deemed to be the author of the image because he gave, and this is a quote, because he gave visible form by posing the said Oscar Wilde in front of the camera, implying that in order to win copyright, you need to have adapted the subject to create the image, which is an interesting take on what we think of as copyright now, that we could, in 1882, the judges could only think of copyright being attributed to a creative act and a creative actor. So the only thing that gave Sarony his copyright of that image was the fact that he had altered Oscar Wilde's pose in the image. Otherwise, he would not have the copyright. Okay, and then wind forward now to what we consider to be copyright for photographers, and obviously AI introduces a huge question mark over copyright because it when you're dealing with the subject that didn't exist, then where does that leave Saroni's uh, ownership of his image of Oscar Wilde? And a whole new legal framework needs to be created. We've already moved on in copyright terms. We already attribute copyright to the photographer, no matter what was going on in front of the camera, and the only exceptions are when the photographer is bought out or the rights have been given away in some way. So, but we now see that copyright to the photographer, is automatically assumed. Ritchin goes on to talk about current efforts to watermark images as a way of marking AI gen and non-AI generated images are not taking hold. And Ritchin implores AI companies to address this, but notes that although OpenAI and others are working with the so-called Content Authenticity Project, and I'll come back to that in a minute, there are many reasons why the tags, the standard, this standard adds to images are easily traduced and therefore are not going to be part of a global solution to the problem of making AI gen and non-AI images solution to the problem of marking AI gen and non-AI images effectively. In other words, there is a movement afoot, but it isn't going very far because the major players are not engaging with it, and and until they do, it's very easy to remove the watermark or to add a watermark, so to an AI image or to remove it from a non-AI image, and so we've got a long way to go there before there's a standard that we can hold to. And so I just want to mention on the Content Authenticity Project, and I will put a link to this, and I think that all photographers should have a look at this and consider joining. It's a proper funded project that is attempting to produce a standard, to provide the world of photography with a standard that guarantees the authenticity of an image. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it here because it's way too complex. But just at a very, very on face value, you go onto the Content Authenticity Project's website and it immediately talks about authenticating the image. Whereas you go onto the Adobe Authentication Project website and it's about guaranteeing the rights of the creators of the image. So I urge all photographers and content creators to check out the Content Authenticity Project. It is a noble attempt to bring some integrity to this rapidly changing area of image consumption and dissemination. Ritchin goes into a project, and I'm going to praise it here, that he tried to implement in 2004, and arguably Ritchin is probably one of the first people to see the need to formalize some kind of arrangement for this, and he created a thing called the Four Corners Project. And the idea was that you would place different levels, different information in the four corners of an image, which could include a watermark or an authenticity stamp, other content that relates somehow to the image that you're looking at, links to other areas, and it's quite an exciting idea. You think that one image can do so many things, and it makes the image a nexus for authenticity, but also for greater learning on the part of the reader. He got some funding for this, and you can still look it up. So if you want to look up the Four Corners Project, you can see it. But as it was 2004, it's pretty, it hasn't been developed. And I think for obvious reasons, it's kind of clunky, and possibly in 2004 the technology was not there yet. And anyway, um, okay, so I mean, Ritchin, to be faithful to Ritchin's own writing, he gives an example of why the Four Corners um, uh, approach to showing photography would be that, let's say, go back to that picture of Aylan Kurdi on the beach, the young boy drowned, um, and washed up on the beach, and the Four Corners would. I mean, I've written here one point that Richard makes would be that this method could be used to give powerful alternative images, such as family snaps of Aylan Kurdi, that would tie into his assertion that non-linear narratives are the most powerful way to use still photography for news and events. So what he's saying is that if you could show a picture, you wouldn't just be showing the picture, this devastating image of a young boy washed up on the beach, drowned, but you would also then show other contextual images, not made by the photographer, but designed to provide more context to the first image, to the main image, and that would be like other domestic family snaps made by made by the family of Aylan, which would give even more devastating consequence to the image that we've all seen. Um, so I can see why, in theory, it's a really brilliant idea. I can also see why it would be. It's quite an earnest idea, and it has a very good heart, but it would be very hard to actually pull off. And I think that a lot of Ritchin's readership are the people with an assumed level of concern. And I think the greatest number of people that are reading news online or whatever are not necessarily people whose primary concern is the truth uh, a, as an essential component of life or living in a democracy. So again, I think it's a great idea, but destined to failure through clunkiness and a lack of relevance to so many people. I mean, before I finish on this, I will faithfully report that in line with the non-fiction photography ethics, that Ritchin allows that the Four Corners Project would enable photographers also to include data, essential data, perhaps coordinates, timestamps, and things like that, which give even greater truth to the image. So I think we'll move on from that, but good idea. But yeah. And Ritchin asked why photographers should not be given a leading role in contextualizing their images. And he mentions a couple of softwares which can help protect from third-party manipulation. So photographers should be agents in the protection of their own image from future manipulation, as well as being agents in the what would you call it, the verification of their images, and they're not being asked to do that. That is left entirely to the media organizations that disseminate their images. And Ritchin has a point here. I think that why a photographer is not brought into this story, into this essential part of truth discernment image sharing. And he goes on to talk about and I'll just mention the two softwares, which I don't know whether they work or whether they're still in development or not, but he mentions Nightshade and Glaze as two content protection softwares, so you can look them up. Ritchin discusses the potential harm to photographers from AI gen who sterilize their subject because a text prompt is required that results in that results in returns which the AI that you're using considers acceptable. So you may want to dig into something really pretty controversial, but the AI generator will return something much less, let's say, raw or controversial than you would like. And so AI has a sort of personality that doesn't like to offend. And that is true. I mean, you can try that for yourself. And he tries to find a way of. So Richard now is beginning to end. He's ending this chapter, and he's trying to find a way of AI becoming part of the solution rather than the problem. And he's talking about ways that AI can now be brought in to create new ways of engaging with ideas, and that moves us on to chapter 7, the final chapter, shifting paradigms. So Ritchin says that photography has morphed into a new contract with the user in that items in a photograph are now desirants of an imagined self or world as opposed to reference of the real world. I'll just unpack that. I have actually talked about this before. What he's saying here is that the difference between a photograph and a photo-like, which is my term for an AI-generated image that looks like a photograph, is that a photograph is a referent of the real world. I mean, if I picked up a camera, I take a picture with my phone, click. I mean, regardless of, let's not get into how much the phone manipulates things and all that, but literally in the corners of the thing, I could map what my vision here to what I see on the phone in real time, and I can tell you that it is true. The window's over there, shelf over there, and so on. There's no context here. It's just literally pick up the phone and it takes a picture and it's done. What is in front of it comes through onto its sensor, and that's there. AI generated. AI that is what we call referent to the real world. AI generation is deserent of the real world, meaning it is formed out of our desire. The image is formed out of a desire that is injected into the the machine of the AI through algorithms that that you want to change. You want a picture of a person standing next to a beach, which is beautiful, or you want a picture of a catastrophe. So you make the image through AI, but it is your desire to create a certain image, which creates that image, which forms that image. It was never the real world. And although the image may look like it was taken in the real world, it never was. And so we have to change the way that we think about image making. Ritchin, I paraphrase him, but I say, despite some messaging, we do not control the information age. Instead, we are addicted to imagery that remakes the world in our own likeness. We are fed that imagery and the world becomes that which we feed upon. Okay, so we're fed the imagery. We look at the imagery. We stop caring whether it's AI or real, and then we create images which are now part of generated by a desire that in some way whose source is this soup of imagery, fake and real, that we have in our brains, in our minds. And this is and so I write that this is a paradigm shift in the consumption of photography from being a system of visual reference to the world beyond our knowledge to a way of reflecting the world in our desires. So this, I think, sets down very squarely the problem of living in a world where images are created by human desire rather than by a direct or intentional or unintentional reference to the real world. And so what is the value of a witness? This is on page 207. Ritchin asks, what is the value of a witness in a post-truth era? And Ritchin says, and I'm quoting here, serious photographies will have to reconsider their missions in light of the changing culture. They need to commit to a transparency that clarifies their strategies for the reader and provides more context to anchor and augment the photograph. This is sort of harking back to the previous chapter, but would you go? I mean, as a photographer, do you need to go into a trouble spot and put your life at risk if you could just as easily build an AI image that was truthful in its intention, but was completely fictitious in that it never what is said to have taken place never actually took place. And so the photographer becomes now the photographer could become, if the lines between referent and deserent images are blurred sufficiently, the photographer can then choose to create AI images that suit their intention rather than actually going into the field and getting the image. And there's a genuine question there. I mean, is it always bad? I'm not making a moral judgment on this, because I think that there are cases when it may be actually desirable potentially to have a constructed image rather than a real image. I mean, in previous chapters, we've said, when, let's say, we want to show something that's happened in a shocking or vivid way, but we don't want to identify any of the real people that took part in it. And you can imagine why, for obvious reasons, like student protesters in Iran and so on. Right, and I suppose just thinking off the top of my head, if that became more common, would it encourage people in repressive regimes to protest more if they knew that news organizations around the world would carry that images of the protest that were truthful in, say, the construction and architecture that they depicted, but not truthful in the identities of the people that were taking part? So to a degree, to a very large degree, the participants in a demonstration would be protected from identification. So I make a note about Ritchin's note or advocation of photographers needing to consider themselves in the marketplace of truth. And I note that photographers photograph, but context is provided on publication. The means of providing context to the viewer is still key. BBC Verify, for example, is an attempt to show their workings out when they say that an attack on a train station took place. You should be able to go on to BBC Verify, and they will show triangulating evidence that claims beyond doubt that what they said happened did actually happen, and you can look at other data sources for yourself to prove this. Um, um, but so Berger says that. So actually, I'm going to miss this point out. It's about Ritchin. Okay, I've started, so I'll carry on. Ritchin is still discussing the value of shocking images in the wake of AI, and it is true. I mean, how can an AI image shock? As I heard somebody say, how could an AI ghost be scary? You know, there's no shock value in an AI image if you know it's an AI image. If you don't know it's an AI image, then then it's just as shocking as a real photograph. But to counter that, Ritchin quotes John Berger as saying that that shocking images, all they do is make us aware of our own lack of moral fortitude, um, and uh, and Susan Sontag has said a similar thing in uh, regarding the pain of others, and that is another very interesting aspect of AI generated images, is their possibility of causing that shock that traditionally we've accrued to photography, or to traditional photography. Um, So I note on 209, on page 209, Ritchin is still hung up on his attempts to create images through AI, and I just, you know, I tried using his prompts to. This was actually when I made the. So today is the what is it, the 5th of June, 2026. And I was writing these notes in October 25, and I used the same AI image generators as he did with the same prompts, and got completely different and much more accurate uh, uh, visual renditions than Ritchin got. So I think anybody who, if you do decide to read this book, just skip all the stuff. I mean, skip it, but take with a pinch of salt Ritchin's own investigations into the ability of AI to do anything, AI image generators to do anything useful with a visual prompt, uh, which they're now much better at doing. So Ritchin speculates that AI's plasticity could meld with that of an image to create new ways of understanding, either through the structure of an image itself or by suggesting alternative interactive routes to further discovery. So here, Ritchin speculates that AI's plasticity could meld with that of an image to create new ways of understanding, either through the structure of an image itself or by suggesting alternative and interactive routes to further discovery. So this is where you could say, you could ask AI, you put a picture in, you could say, using this image, what other aspects of that image could a viewer, a reader, look at to give them a more three-dimensional cultural view of the original image? And here, Ritchin is trying to find new ways that AI could bring more value to bear on photography than it is currently being used, which is fundamentally to undermine the truth value of photography itself. And he says that, well, I'm paraphrasing, AI has the potential to harness and create new forms derived from the multitudinous facets of reality that are beyond synthesis by the human mind. In other words, AI may be harnessed to find new reflections of the world. And what he means here is that AI can use data to create new imagery. So, for example, with climate change, it's quite hard to show climate change in an image, in a single image. Typically people show deserts or storms or things like that. Well, AI could be used to truthfully gather huge amounts of data and then render them into some sort of graphical, either photo-like or movie-like form, or into some sort of, you know, graphic form that encapsulates the truth of the data, which is beyond our potential to discern the truth behind that data, and that in fact, using the power of AI, we can find new ways to interrogate huge amounts of data which are communicable to more people around the world. And Ritchin asks on page 211, can artificial intelligence help us to analyze and reconfigure the world in a way that might lead to greater coherence? For example, could AI be used to create better personal understandings, and the word personal, so on a very human level, understandings of climate change that provoke action? AI can turn enormous amounts of data into something more human. So this is a great idea, and I'm sure that in fact, I know that there are people doing this already as a way of communicating really immensely complex truth in a way that is digestible by average people. And I mean, he suggests that another point is that let's say that you were photographing a community. There were photographs of a community. Let's say Kensal Green, okay, and you wanted to do some research into photography made in Kensal Green over a period of time. Perhaps with AI, you could do a search of photographs that were made by people who lived in Kensal Green, as opposed to people who didn't live in Kensal Green. I mean, to be fair, the example of Kensal Green is probably not the best one, but if you were to talk about an event, a newsworthy event where you wanted to find the perspective of people who actually were living in that area, such as a protest or something like that, you would get the images from citizen protesters first, rather than news media representatives, which would normally come up. And so we need to find a new ethics about the image making capabilities of AI. And he notes on page 218 that fMRI scanning techniques are getting better at reproducing images formed inside the mind. That is truly terrifying. I mean, these machines are beginning to be able to read our minds. And so the image making capabilities of AI are now being used to devastating effect or potentially devastating effect in new applications of science and technology where the human mind is concerned. And the human mind at this moment is sacrosanct. It is not party to the I suppose this is this is a very big question, because people are constantly trying to fuck with your head. Advertising is all about messing with your mind. Deep fakery and all of that is all about messing with your mind. And so, but now through AI, we are literally being able to read people's minds. And that has huge consequences for all humanity. It makes lie detectors look like a very basic Lego set. We can use artificial intelligence to investigate what is outside of photography's normal ken. And believe and so this is sort of just wrapping everything up. Ritchin believes that correct use of AI means that the image becomes the beginning of discovery rather than the end of it, which it always has been. I mean, it's always been, this is the fact, that's it, when it comes to a photograph. Whereas a photograph can now be said to begin to have so many facets to it that that we don't just read a photograph for the two-dimensional graphic formation that it is, that we can use it in a very three-dimensional way to bounce off into different areas, which embellish and enhance the fundamental democratic act of truth search. And he finishes by saying by quoting Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, by saying the illiterate of the future will be the person ignorant of the use of the camera as well as the pen. And now we need to add to that AI. So I think that, so that's it. You've done it. You've got to the end. And I would give my final take on this to be that, I mean, I call my Substack Psychographica for a reason. I believe everything begins and ends with the mind, with personal experience. And photography has always been about, let's say, two things, the subject and the photographer. And I would say that photography is about the subject, the photographer, and the reader, because nothing is formed until the image hits the mind of the reader. And the reader is an individual. So no two readers or viewers of photography can have the same experience of the same photograph, because they have such a mess of personal experience and memories and so on in them, that photographs and images always will provoke an individual response. What is worrying about AI and the way that we consume images now, and I touched on this on the last one about how the Instagram devalues the image by just shoving it at us at a rate we can't deal with, but yet we voluntarily engage with. That we are being I would say that the greatest danger to humanity right now is the devaluing of the photographic image, because the photographic image is how we've evolved to or the image, let's just say the image is how we've evolved to share ideas with people who don't necessarily speak the same language as we do. It's the most valuable tool for cross-cultural communication that we have, and it's a representative of the individual psychology of every single one of us. And the moment that somebody takes control of imagery in a way that's nefarious and not above board, and is a desire and uses it for their own desires, i.e., making money, thought control, political control, and all of that sort of thing, that's the moment that AI is fucking with our heads individually and as a group, because although we might have our own response to things, we are astonishingly easy to manipulate on a population basis, as we've seen countless times in history, and we're seeing again now. I mean, if you're from my political perspective, some of the claims of reform and their political adherents are just preposterous, ludicrous, a joke. They don't mean any. I mean, I just can't believe anybody believes in that crap. But somehow people do, and decent people do. And this is what I mean about how vulnerable we are to imagery, to people using imagery. And when you add AI onto that, I mean, we just have to be very, very clued in and aware that when that's happening. And that is, I think, what Ritchin's really good book does, is it starts the conversation. It says, don't be a fucking idiot, when it's never been more important not to be a fucking idiot. And so I'm going to leave you with that. because because I think I've said enough, and I think that Ritchin's said has started a conversation that we can all engage with, and so I hope you've enjoyed this short series. Well, actually, it's been quite long because it's been quite spread out. But thanks, and until the next edition, goodbye. Thanks very much for watching.